I mean, the title is rather self-explanatory. I'm at Vienna International Airport and everything is frozen in time. All the morning passengers are here, all of them unmoving like fleshy, warm statues. Looking outside through the window, I see a flight departing, suspended in the air. Next to me, a woman is dropping her handbag, and all the contents are frozen in the air, unaffected by gravity's pull. Suppose I can elaborate a bit, as, at the moment, it appears that I have all the time in the world. I was on a business trip in Vienna, and I had to travel back to Paris CDG Airport with an early morning flight. On the way towards the terminal, staring out of the cab, I saw the airport lights in the dim, cloudy dawn sky. Some of the departing planes were awfully slow, almost like they were not moving at all. I was thinking of pointing this out to the cabbie, but I chalked it up to tiredness. See, after conference, networking cocktails and 6 a.m. flights are not a great combination, so I was far from being in a chatty mood. Either way, the guy dropped me off, and I decided to have a quick ciggy before checking in. While smoking, I wondered about airports, how fascinating they are. A while ago, during my university years, I had a part-time bartender job at one, and I always found them eerie. They were liminal spaces, areas of the in-between, people just heading there to pass through it, sort of a border world. Of course, seeing airports like that could have been Stockholm Syndrome caused by this student job as well. After all, I needed some sense of wonder to tolerate 5 a.m. shifts, and now, many years later, here I am at 5 a.m. again, but this time, as one of the travelers, a wandering soul lost in the liminal landscape. I let out a brief laugh. The hangover left me way too philosophical, yet the eerie feeling I had turned out to be more of a premonition rather than a hungover inner monologue ramble. Things took a sharp turn for the weird at security. While there were quite a few people, many gates were open, so the crowd moved fast. I got directed towards a freshly opened security station. It was surrounded by tired-looking officers, one instructing me to put my laptops and fluid containers on separate trays, the other two standing behind the metal detector gate, waving me through, and a third one, slightly peculiar. He was sitting behind the monitor of the X-ray machine you put your bags through, wearing huge aviators, basically covering half his face. Ah well, I figured you got to make a fashion statement somehow, even if you're obligated to wear a uniform. Anyways, I was about to walk through the gate, the metal detector, the symbolic border between the mundane and the liminal. But the very moment I stepped through it, complete silence engulfed everything. I reflectively touched my ear, thinking my earbuds somehow turned on noise cancelling, when I realized that they were in the tray, which slowly rolled down on the pickup area. And that was the only thing moving. Everything else stopped, like someone hitting a pause button. Odd, I figured. I slowly walked back through the gate, but nothing changed. Everything around me stood still. The security guy's hand frozen in a bored wave. A man putting his belt back on, unmoving next to me. A family in the other queue, stuck in mid-argument. Their small kid, her face trapped in a mid-crying expression, but no sound leaving her mouth. Wish I could do this to kids once the plane took off. Nevertheless, temporal anomalies be damned. I did not want to miss my plane, so I grabbed my stuff from the tray. Yet, as I was putting my laptop back into my bag, I saw one thing, or, well, the absence of it. The security guy with the sunglasses was nowhere to be found. This whole thing did not look like something that respects airport security standards. Walking towards my gate, D24, in the dead silence was certainly an experience. I moved through crowds in suspended animation, or I sure as hell I hope. It was that. It would be rather awkward to be at an airport full of dead people. Still, it had a certain beauty. Upon arriving to D24, an unusual sight welcomed me. The monitors showed that boarding was open, and indeed, the doors were ajar. But the flight destination, instead of Paris CDG, just looked like a jumbled mess of characters. Now, while my app said that this was the correct gate, I did not want to end up at the wrong location, so I decided on not boarding for now, waiting it out instead, hoping that a staff member or an announcement will clear up the confusion soon. I was a bit hungry, and the nearby bar seemed, albeit overpriced, but fairly attractive. I walked over, crisscrossing the statue-like crowds. I grabbed a sandwich, and, as the staff was unavailable on account of being frozen in time, I decided to walk behind the till to the coffee machine and help myself to some drinks. For a moment, I entertained the thought of making myself a nice flat white. But I figured that if time restarts and I'm standing in a restricted area steaming milk, I may get some angry looks, so I opted for an espresso instead. The tiny cup was halfway through when I heard something familiar, the breaking news announcement of Euronews on a nearby TV screen. Well, something, apart from me, was unaffected by this time fuckery, so I quickly grabbed my coffee and my sandwich. The total was 12.30 Al, so I put a tenner on the counter and figured they can keep the change. Indeed, at the back of the bar, there was a TV broadcasting the morning news, oblivious to the frozen world around it. Chief investigator of the crash of Air France flight. I have hidden the flight ID, just in case, at Vienna Schwechat-Intel airport this morning states that at this time, the exact cause of the accident cannot be determined. While the number of confirmed casualties just passed 80, the search for survivors continues. According to witness testimonies, the aircraft overran the runway during takeoff and crashed into the industrial area of Schwadorf, a settlement near the airport. Authorities have asked the public to forward any information, including recordings of the events, to the authorities. Rather macabre watching these news at an airport. I was thinking, when it hit me like a freight train or like a crashing plane, the flight they were talking about was the one I was supposed to board. Now, while I was trying to cut down on my smoking, this news warranted another cigarette. The airport has a nice smoking area looking at the runway, where a flight was taking off, except it wasn't, as it was just floating silently in a surreal manner. Some sight for a smoke. Yet, as I was clicking my lighter, I noticed something weird. Well, something that should have not been weird, but in this specific scenario, it was rather unusual. A few airport technician-looking guys in high-visibility vests, cargo pants, and despite the cloudy early morning, dark aviator sunglasses were walking around, actually walking, while the world around them was dead still. I'm back now at the restaurant typing this down on my laptop. Now, I know that my demeanor may feel like I'm not taking the situation seriously enough, but trust me, this is my defense mechanism when I'm positively shitting myself, which is pretty much the case now. I mean, I'm not stupid. I saw the news of my crashed plane, and I can connect the dots. I'm wondering if this is limbo, death, or some otherworldly shit. But the call of nature is disrupting my spiral into anxiety after the coffee and the ciggy. I'm not only about to shit myself figuratively, but also literally, so I will try to hunt down a bathroom in this hellscape of an airport. I'll check back in a bit to see if anyone's around and update y'all. Cheerio. Update 1. So I went to answer the call of nature. Luckily, 1 out of the 4 stalls was open at least. I was also not jealous of the poor bastards whom eternity found in the middle of dropping a log. So, I was doing my business when I noticed feet. First, I could see shadows under the stall door, through the gap. Then 2 pairs of work shoes, 2 people walking around in the bathroom. Now, I was about to call out, but something held me back, on top of how awkward it is to have a mid-shit conversation. Soon I realized what set my alarms off. I saw the feet, but I did not hear them. They were walking in complete silence, until they started talking. I reckon they were talking, but I couldn't understand shit. Saying their words were garbled is an understatement. It sounded like a recording of an already foreign language being played backwards, while distorted via a radio. So, I clenched my buttocks and remained silent, until they left. I was not against the idea of trying to communicate with whatever these lads were, but the situation was not exactly ideal, so I decided to delay. Instead of immediately heading back towards the bar near my gate where I've left my luggage and my laptop, I wandered around a little bit, as my plane was not about to leave. Upon inspecting the motionless terminal, I found some of the guys I've seen earlier on the runway, and in the toilet. Contrasting how everything was halted around them, they stood out being busybodies, but they were always behind locked doors, on different floors, or otherwise inaccessible territories, in parts that you would normally not notice while wandering around an airport. Forgive me for sounding like a broken record with the whole liminal spaces thing, but this was another aspect of that. When you're at a place like this, a place of transition, there are so many little nooks and crannies you just look straight through. At an airport, you move with purpose. Everyone moves with purpose, so these areas escape your attention. Now, it was the contrary, in an uncanny way. No one moved with purpose, no one moved, period, except in these hidden places, which highlighted them, making me feel like I'm seeing things I shouldn't be seeing. However, this was not reciprocated. See, I was not particularly hiding, yet none of the employees appeared to react to me in any way. It looked like I had two options: reenact the movie Terminal, except in this ghost airport, or just take my chances to get noticed, so I chose the latter. I started waving at them through the windows of locked doors and shouting at them from floors below, yet they all remained unfazed. Pretty fucking rude, honestly. Or at least this was the case until I got back to my spot. Then things escalated. Returning to the bar where I left my laptop and bags, I could see three of these airport security-looking guys carefully circling my luggage, discussing it in their garbled radio language. However, upon my arrival, unlike the other airport staff, this trio noticed me, and they made it painfully obvious that they did. As soon as I approached, they turned towards me in perfect unison. Now, I know that leaving your bags unattended like that is a big no-no at airports, and in a normal situation, I wouldn't have done so, but it's rather clear that this was far from what could be considered normal. I hoped that they would agree, so I apologetically explained to them that I was just heading to the pisser for a little bit. My excuse did not seem to convince them. The two dudes on the side kept staring at me through their oversized sunglasses, unmoving, while the third one began to walk towards me with seemingly malicious intent. I attempted to defuse the situation diplomatically, but seeing how he steadily moved his hand towards a black, taser-looking device holstered on his belt, I concluded that my charisma will not save me today, so I resorted to the next best alternative: violence. I know full well that my following reaction was not a rational, well-adjusted one. Assaulting airport staff is a fine way to get banned from flying for life, after all. But let me explain. See, in my late teenage years, I had a short stint as an employee at a shoddy nightclub. Some of my experiences there irreversibly altered my fight-or-flight instinct into punch first, ask questions later, and believe me, I felt threatened enough to have my reflexes take over. So anyways, I swung at the bastard. Admittedly, I am not in my best shape. Definitely not after last night, so I was somewhat surprised seeing him collapse like a sack of flour as soon as my knuckles connected to his face, sending his earpiece, cap and glasses flying. I was somewhat even more surprised seeing the other two guards immediately dematerialize in the same moment, just gone, in a blink. I began to suspect that these guys were not your usual bored, underpaid, caffeine-addicted airport staff, but something more sinister. Soon enough, my suspicion became certainty. The less lucky one of these entities I whacked laid in front of me face down. To see the damage I may have caused, and to check his pulse just in case, I grabbed his shoulders and turned him on his back, so he faced towards me. Now, remember I said these guys looked like normal airport employees? Well, there was a little bit of a difference. The guy had like a million eyes. The face, previously covered by the dark, tinted lenses, which now lay shattered on the floor, stared at me with countless pupils. Small ones, big ones, just dotted all over the sockets in a way that should not be possible. Not entirely unlike a spider, but way more crowded. In fact, there were simply too many of them. They should have not fit the space normally only occupied by two eyes, yet there they were. Kind of like a Mandelbrot fractal, they appeared to be almost infinite, and frankly, fairly hypnotic, but I had to snap out of it. For the lack of anything better to do, I figured I'd sit down and type this update. I have mixed feelings about the situation. On the one hand, I'm somewhat relieved that I didn't ruin the day of some poor bastard at the airport. AMD parallelly didn't ruin my chances of me flying ever again. But in the meantime, I am a tad perplexed by what could be the consequences for KOing a timeless, slightly eldritch entity. On top of that, I can't really get those eyes out of my mind, and not in a romantic way. See, no pun intended. I honestly don't know for how long I was staring into them. But once I was out of it, I felt like I remembered something. I'm not too sure what yet, but I think I'll take another smoke break to try and figure it out. Here's hoping that my pal won't go anywhere. I'll get back to y'all soon. Update 2. Midway through my ciggy, I realized that the unconscious guy may have a way of entering those little hidden areas I was ranting about beforehand. Since at this point I was fairly certain that the areas accessible for passengers won't hold any answers, I figured I could borrow a keycard. Spare me from the moral lesson of looting from a hopefully only unconscious entity. Of course, these security gates also require a password in addition to the keycard, but since apart from the trio messing with my luggage, no one acknowledged my existence, it was not particularly difficult to follow one of these mysterious walkers towards an off-limits area and peek at the 4 digits password over their shoulders. The key code was, I shit you not, 4444, airport security, my ass. I opened the security door and entered a bland, white, blindingly lit hallway. leaving the passenger area with its soothing colors, kitschy decorations and fake plants, and entering a blindingly lit barren security hallway. Surprisingly, it didn't give me as much of a whiplash as I expected it would. Of course, this corridor had none of the artificially welcoming atmosphere of the traveler's lounge, but it still felt like that the two areas were related. I can already hear your snarky comments saying yes, both are parts of the airport, dumbasses, but it's not that. It felt like the empty corridor represented the reality of this place, and outside of it, all the bits and bobs that made it feel welcoming were just there to ease people in a sense of familiarity instead of liminality. But here, behind the thick blue doors, that poorly fitting facade was dropped. No siree, no comfy feelings, colourful advertisements, and €2 massage chairs here for you. The corridor screamed, through the humming of the bright white neon lights, that you're a stranger, and you shouldn't be here. Too bad I got used to people screaming at me not to do things, then doing them anyways, and corridors, I guess, kinda ruined that metaphor here. So I marched on, peering into barren office rooms, some of them containing some oblivious airport entities, their real self hidden behind their sunglasses. After a bit of wandering, I noticed an area labelled monitoring room, and on a whim, I entered. The label didn't lie. There sure were some monitors in there, like a lot of monitors, way too many for it to fit a room of this size. They weirdly reminded me of the jumbled mess of eyes the entity I knocked out, and as this thought entered my mind and I remembered staring into those eyes, the smorgasbord of screens suddenly started to make sense, and I began to see security camera footage steadily shifting through all of them. At first glance, they appeared to be normal security feeds, but upon closer inspection, I noticed some increasingly unusual things at each one I looked at. The first anomaly I noticed was an image depicting the frozen scenery at the departure gates, including the big board listing all the flights, flight numbers and destinations, except apparently the 1300 Aeroflot flight was scheduled to leave to Pulkovo Airport, Leningrad. On another screen, the corridor with unmoving people had big billboards behind them, one of them proudly displaying a vaguely familiar elderly guy, who, despite looking 80+, still had a fabulous pompadour haircut, and next to it, with big bold letters, The King 90, Elvis Live, at Ernst Happel Stadion, Vienna, 08 January. On another, every sign and advertisement was written in German. I am in Austria, but still, the complete lack of English was unusual in an international airport. In addition, airport security was wearing uncomfortably sharp uniforms with red armbands. As I looked closer in a corner of the screen, I had to do a double take, as a sizable portrait of a certain mustached failed artist and piece of shit was there on full display. Each screen I looked at showed this airport, but subtly, or less subtly, altered. I was witnessing different realities from a nondescript nerve center. After a certain point, I found the security footage of the little bar I left my stuff at earlier, and I noticed something pretty upsetting. And bear in mind, after seeing a long-dead dictator's painting on a wall, the bar to upset me was placed pretty fucking high. See, you remember that TV I've seen the news report of the plane crash of my flight? I could kind of make out through the security screens that it was still broadcasting about the accident. The issue is, the broadcast was the same in all the alternative realities, no matter how many screens I was looking at. Apparently there are some worlds where Elvis survives or where the USSR still stands, but it appears that my fucking plane overshoots the runaway and blows up in each one. Bit of a bummer, really. I snapped out of staring at the screen, thanks to the beep of a walkie-talkie laid down on the table next to the screens. The sound was followed by a conversation of the airport staff, in their unusual, incomprehensible language, until it stopped being incomprehensible. As I started to focus on it, just like on the creature's eyes, and later on the screens, I simply realized that I understood what they were saying. I'll try my best to translate. Execution error for Cornerstone event number 4778 due to passenger victim manifest incomplete. Please advise Handler A out. Handler A, we may have an update on your situation. Analytics depth. Confirm the identity of the interloper. Missing Cornerstone event manifest parameters are at value match with interloper. Handler B out. You know those moments when two people are shit-talking a third one, not knowing that said third person is within clear earshot of them? The whole stitch began to feel like that. I mean, I'm pretty sure that you figured out who they refer to as interloper the same time as I did. Yours truly. Now, as the subject of the conversation, I felt that I was warranted to contribute. So I pressed the button on the radio, and to the best of my ability, I tried to speak in their language and mimic their expert talking style. Handler A, Handler B, this is Interloper reporting. Please advise on how to assist in resolving issue with Cornerstone event parameters. Interloper out. A bit of inconvenient silence followed. I had a feeling that someone was about to be fired. Roger that, Interloper. Please stand by until HQ is instructed. More silence. This is Handler A to HQ. Initiate Cornerstone event rollback. Active Handler Group, this is HQ. Please confirm rollback request. I was wondering if they were aware that I can hear all this shit. Handler A confirming. Handler B confirming. Active Handler Group, this is HQ. Air France Flight TSX, of course, my goddamn flight. Return to Cornerstone event launch position. Awaiting parameter correction. Finally, they got back to me. Interloper, this is Handler B. Do you copy? Interloper, come in. Loud and clear, Handler B, I responded, fighting back the urge to wish him good luck in his future job hunt. Interloper, please return to the initial spatial coordinates of departure from your host timeline. Once your spatial coordinates are approved, your temporal coordinates will be reset. Please continue routine to ensure Cornerstone event success. Right, great. So I go back to the security gate where this whole mess started. My good friend Handler B resets time. I board my flight, then crash and die, and ensure that the Cornerstone event is done in my timeline. Wouldn't that be a right, heroic sacrifice? Roger that, Interloper will comply. I said, hell fucking no, I thought. I'm typing this note just in front of that ominous security gate that froze time the moment I passed it. If I understand the handler correctly, the moment I pass it again, time will restart. One way to find out. See you on the other side. Final update. Okay, so it worked. I'm typing away from the same bar I was sitting at, except now everything is in motion again. All is well now. Well, almost all. As soon as I passed through the gate and everything suddenly reanimated, I began to feel a bit nauseous. Was it the fact that after hours spent in a frozen, soundless and timeless world, suddenly the hustle and bustle of reality returned? Or was it because I was still hungover as hell, and it didn't occur to me that I could have nicked a paracetamol while time stood still? Dunno, but I needed to shake it off and get the closest thing I could to a cold shower, a thorough face wash. Except, as I was drying my mug, staring at myself in the bathroom mirror, the eyes of my mirror image started to blur and proliferate. Who knows, maybe soon I will have to invest in some large dark aviators. I can also catch some unusual changes in the corner of my eyes. Is that a poster of Elvis over here? That sign that was in English just a moment ago, is it now written in Cyrillic? But apart from these minor inconveniences, most things seem to be okay. So, am I about to board a crashing plane? Nah, as you may have figured that I am not great in following instructions. As soon as I was back, I set my VPN up and sent a couple of anonymous emails to airport security, to the police, to Air France, letting them know that something is off with that flight. I see that it is delayed now, and they are replacing the craft, citing technical issues. If I'm actually losing it, and imagined the whole thing, I probably ruined the day of my fellow travelers. But if not, then I just helped those poor bastards to live to see another day. But about the implications of me doing that, well... So, all sunshine and rainbows, right? I ought to pat myself on the back. I fucked around with beings beyond time and prevented a major accident. Yeah, normally I would. But there are some subtle things going on that overshadow my urge to celebrate. See, the eerie sunglasses wearing part of the crew is still around, and they definitely look a bit more agitated than before. And while I couldn't really catch all their conversations, here and there I hear some jumbled radio fragments I still understand. They mention a certain Cornerstone correction protocol and enhanced intensity events in close proximity. Now what does that mean in practice? Hell if I know. But, and I know I am being pretty vague here, it sounds like shit is about to go down. Well, either way, they're calling my flight. Suppose it is time for me to leave this godforsaken airport. Before the burnt people took over, my grandfather's homestead was an oasis of calm. The homestead was in the midst of the steppe, but neither forest nor mountains were far. My cousin and I spent most of our childhoods there. It was a good place for young boys to grow up. Our parents worked, the city was rough, and the old man could always use an extra pair of hands. We had free rein over the property, but our grandfather always warned us to not venture into the nearby forest. At night, by the light of the stove, He would tell us stories about a dark place of science which we were to avoid at all costs. He called it the Gilimicondergi. Though tales of evil and corruption and the incomprehensible piqued our young interest, neither me nor my cousin disobeyed our grandfather's instructions. As long as we were obedient, the old man was kind. Neither of us were interested in seeing his anger, though the prospect of a cursed science facility provoked all sorts of alluring vapors from our imagination. We kept ourselves satiated by playing with the massive turtles we'd find in the grass. After we finished our schooling, my cousin moved out west. He always had a mind for business and thought of himself as the next great global innovator. I, on the other hand, preferred a quieter life. For a couple of years I worked in the city doing jobs not worth mention, and then, when the honking of cars and smell of smog got on my nerves, I moved back out into the homestead to help care for the old man. As we grew older and wearier of fairy tales, my grandfather shifted his stories from the fantastical to practical warnings about drugs, guns, and affairs with married women. Yet, near the end of his life, confined to his bed with me as his sole caretaker, the old man returned to speaking of the Gilimicondergi. He pleaded with me, as if he could see the future in his fevered dreams, that both me and my cousin and anyone we cared for were to stay away from the forest. He also demanded that we never sell the property, lest it ends up in the hands of forces beyond the reach of man. At the time, I dismissed his words as the ramblings of an unwell mind. The funeral was a small, private affair for a quiet man who lived in solitude. There is much bureaucracy associated with properly burying the dead. It's in the various office waiting rooms that I made peace with my grandfather's passing. The funeral, to me, was but an end to the legal proceedings by then. As distant as the ceremony was to me, however, during the funeral repast, I found a familiar face that brought tears to my eyes. It was my cousin. He had travelled across half the globe to come pay his respects. Though he missed the burial, he stayed for the food. When I found out he had arrived straight from the airport and was yet to arrange his accommodation, I didn't ask. I insisted. My cousin would sleep in the guest house at the homestead. He was, after all, going to be inheriting half of it. My cousin was happy to accompany me out of town. He was curious about how my life had been over the past couple of years. He was also curious about the property. My cousin had made a name for himself out west. Initially, he worked for an import/export company that he quickly rose through the ranks of, and once he had accumulated enough capital, he started to invest. He had made a name for himself in stocks, and he was in the process of making an even bigger name for himself in the realm of cryptocurrency. Even though most of his money was tied up in the clouds, however, my cousin was curious about other investment opportunities. For the first week he stayed with me, my cousin didn't mention anything about developing the land. Occasionally, he would bemoan the lack of Wi-Fi or hot water, but for the most part he would speak about the inherent tranquility of the homestead. He said people out west would pay good money to get away from the rumble of urban life to a place like this. It's not until a week into staying on the property that my cousin suggested we try setting up a business. I did not like the idea of developing the land at first, even when my cousin promised to shoulder all of the construction costs. I disliked the idea of strangers spending time at the homestead. I was resistant at first, but the man had a way with words. He also owned half of the property. The construction crew that worked on additional housing was beyond rowdy and tested my patience every step of the way. Yet, when they set up the water boiler in the guest house, they bought my sympathies. Daily hot showers soothed my temper, and soon enough I found myself amicable to the idea of the homestead being turned into a resort. As my cousin would say, we found much peace on the property when we were young. It would be a sin not to make some money off of sharing it. After about a year and a half, the housing my cousin had commissioned was completed. The cottages were humble, and my grandfather's old home was transformed into a relaxing communal area. Though the lodgings were nice and my cousin offered them for a bargain, we had trouble finding customers. My cousin had accrued a substantial amount of debt and was turning more agitated with every trip he took to the city. Apparently, along with the troubles with our new resort, his cryptocurrency portfolio had turned shaky. He floated the idea of selling the property, but he only did so once. On his following trip to the city, he returned with Batima. Batima said she could ensure our resort would be well booked, and my cousin's financial woes would be fixed. I have met few people with piercings throughout my life, but if they were to gather all their jewelry in a pile, they wouldn't have even half of the metal Batima carried on her face. She dressed in garish bright colours and constantly smoked, and didn't inspire the smallest bit of confidence in me. Fatima looked well out of place at our step resort, yet she was well versed in the art of the internet. Though I did not know where to look whenever the two of us spoke, Fatima kept to her promise. Soon enough, the resort was turning a profit. Through social media and a couple of personal favors, Fatima managed to bring our resort to the forefront of people's search result. After but a couple of weeks, we had various influencers from around the world come through our little resort and sing praises to their audiences, who in turn replicated their idol's pilgrimage. I would spend most of my time in my separated cottage, but whenever I walked through the lobby, Fatima would be there. Sometimes she'd be working on her laptop. Sometimes she would be chatting with the guests and recommending hikes and other local attractions. We never spoke much. For months, Fatima remained a stranger to me. Yet one morning, when two unexpected visitors showed up at our humble resort, I found an ally in her. They both wore lab coats and introduced themselves as Dr. Barrett and Professor Willow. Barrett was local, had a messy head of black hair, and seemed to be the less talkative of the two. Willow towered over his colleague and led all the negotiations. Willow, unlike Barrett, was American. When the man realized I couldn't properly understand him, he aimed all of his communication at my cousin and Fatima. My cousin made little effort to translate, but Fatima was kind enough to keep me in the loop. The two men in lab coats, according to Fatima, were representatives of a scientific organization that was looking for housing for their employees. They were interested in buying the property. The offered sum spread a smile across my cousin's face, yet Fatima disagreed with it. Apparently the place had more potential. I knew little of the financials, but I didn't like Dr. Barrett nor Professor Willow. I told my cousin I thought Fatima was right, and that I would not consent to a sale to the two men. When my refusal was translated to Professor Willow, like a child, he stormed out of my cousin's office. Dr. Barrett hung around for a while longer, gently prodding at my cousin with the promise of quick cash, but when it became clear the property would not be sold, he too made his exit. My cousin wasn't pleased with how negotiations had panned out, but Fatima soothed his woes. The resort was, after all, doing well. If he would give her time, she could bring in even more revenue with a couple renovations and investments. My cousin was reluctant, yet eventually, with a fair amount of prodding from me, he acquiesced. When the meeting was over, Fatima walked me to my cottage. "I presume you're familiar with the stories they tell about the nearby woods?" she asked as she lit up her hand-rolled cigarette. I told her I was. "And I presume you don't believe in them?" I told her I didn't. "Neither do I," she said. "But if I did, I would presume those two have business in that forest. I don't believe in children's fairy tales, but I also wouldn't want to risk getting into bed with anyone from the Galumi Kondurgu." It had been years since I heard the name. Each syllable of that terrible sound cracked through the cold air like invisible fireworks. I told her I agreed. And thanked her for taking my side. Though the land was not sold to the two men in lab coats, Fatima kept her end of the bargain. Over the next half a year, my grandfather's homestead transformed once again. What was once a humble family resort became the detox zone. The walls got brighter, the decor took on a distinctly New Age aesthetic, and the tranquil whistling of the wind was replaced with constant meditation music. The look of the resort was wholly foreign to me, and I disliked the breed of entitled people that would replace our old clientele. But Fatima kept her promise fully. The detox zone brought in significantly more revenue than we ever saw before. I retreated to my cottage, saved up my share of the profits, and watched the resort grow at a distance. Every once in a while, Fatima would drop by for tea and tell me tales of the bizarre questions the tourists would ask, but our friendship was sporadic and only experienced in short bursts. My cousin, on the other hand, would be at my cottage just about every week with a new bottle of expensive liquor. With every visit, he would reveal more plans for expansion and new avenues for his money to grow. Every visit he offered to take me along for his investment adventures, and every visit I declined. There were moments when his talk of wealth and luxury had me doubting my resolve, but I am happy I kept my money safe. Were I to join him on his financial misadventures, I too would have ended up destitute. My cousin made some bad investments. A sizable chunk of his money went towards a locally produced hair loss product. In the same breath that he would bemoan all the lawsuits and his imminent financial ruin, the man would still swear by the hair cream. A lot of money was sunk. Some serious people were involved. My cousin needed cash quick. He didn't even ask. One morning, I simply found Professor Willow peeking into the window of my cottage. He had his face pressed up against the glass, as if he were trying to spot an animal in a zoo. When he saw that I saw him, Willow's eyes filled with malicious glee. He grinned and waved and stood still for nigh a minute, and then he left. I barely pulled on my coat when my cousin barged into the room. He had made a deal, he assured me. A good payout, a really good payout. For the both of us, with a nice holiday bonus for Batima. Willow offered him considerably better money and, since he knew I didn't want to leave the property, he even secured me ownership over the cottage. Willow was just going to house scientists. It would be a calmer affair than the rich hippies. My cousin assured me that what he did was necessary and that I had no right to be angry with him. I didn't argue. I was angry, but my cousin looked to be on the edge of a nervous breakdown. I had seen the sort of business partners my cousin had. I knew he had little choice. I was displeased with my cousin's handling of the property, but by evening I found some solace in the idea of housing scientists. They would be, I hoped, a quiet bunch. I went to sleep that night presuming my life would not change much. Soon enough, however, I would meet the burnt people. It wasn't long after the detox zone cleared out that I started to feel uneasy at night. Back when the resort was still functional, there would be outdoor lighting to make sure none of the tourists stumble off into the wilderness. I quickly found myself missing those blinding lights. Each night there was at least one moment I was certain someone was watching me from the darkness. According to the deal my cousin struck, I was still allowed access to my cottage, but the rest of the property was wholly off limits to me. The lobby of the resort was always guarded by a duo of tall men with shaved heads and a constant sneer on their face. At first, I thought I had simply witnessed two twins on the same shift, but as the days passed I always saw the same two faces. Just as the thoughts of how many of the same specimen might be employed as security, the guards were given helmets, and their identity was obscured. Another construction crew arrived at the resort a couple of weeks after the guards appeared. The crew was much quieter than anyone else who had ever worked on the property, and they would actively ignore me when I tried to make idle chatter. At first, I presumed that the crew was there to make adjustments to the resort rooms, yet very little of the original structure was touched. Instead, the work crew erected large black sheets above the resort, as if they were trying to hide something from satellites. The guards wouldn't say a word to me, and my cousin would never answer his phone. I was worried about what was happening on my grandfather's property. I was also worried about the lengthening absence of any communication with my cousin. What I truly should have worried about were the occupants of the new detox zone. The sound of footsteps on gravel woke me up. It couldn't have been more than 5:30. The sun was barely up. Were it not for the light sleep from the stress, I wouldn't have even woken up. They were walking right by my window. At first I thought I was still half in dream, yet there were many of them, and the sight of them quickly sobered me. Outside of my window, in a single file line, walked dozens of scientists. They wore clean lab coats, and some of them even had spectacles, but they all had the complexion of corpses. The scientists were burnt beyond recognition. With some, their flesh was merely seared. With others, it was charcoal black. None of them looked like they should be walking. Most of them looked like they shouldn't be breathing. Out of a sheer sense of disbelief, I rose from bed and peered closely from the window. I had hoped that the terrible state of the procession would have just been some sinister trick of the light. It wasn't. Not only were there charred corpses walking by my window, they were also looking back at me. Some of them had eyes, most of them did not. None of them stopped. They all had their heads turned towards me, but they still walked on in their single file line. It was only the last scientist of the procession that properly acknowledged me. The man's eyeballs were shriveled, but I could not help but meet them. With a long, charred finger, he tapped on the glass. And then, with something that resembled a furrowed brow, he shook his head. I hid in my cottage until I was sure he was gone. Then, as quickly as humanly possible, I raced to my car and drove off to the city. I tried desperately to get a hold of my cousin. His phone was off. When I went to the hotel he used to stay at whenever he had business in the city, the receptionist said she had not seen him in months. I called Batima. She met me a couple hours later at a cafe in the center. She still had a couple hooks in her, but most of her jewelry was gone. Batima was muted, and not soon after we sat down, she explained why. She had heard things about my cousin through the grapevine. Most likely he had lost more than money in his hair product deal. Batima presumed the reason why I wanted to meet was because of my cousin. Though the confirmation of my fears stung, the events of the morning were much more pressing. Lowering my voice in an effort to contain my sanity, I told her about the burnt scientists. She listened without any judgment. Even when I talked about the charred cadaver tapping on my window, her face didn't twitch. She simply nodded, smoked her cigarettes, and took long sips of coffee whenever I struggled for words. "I presume your opinion on the stories of what happens in the forest has changed," she finally said, when my terrible tale concluded. I nodded. "You aren't the only one," she said, as she finished off her coffee. "We made some good money with the detox zone. I would suggest you take that money and move away from the property as soon as possible. You can't enjoy that money when you're dead. You can't enjoy that money when you're living near the Gillimi Konderge." The name of that terrible place once again crackled in the wind. I did not need Batima's advice to convince me. All her words did was assure me that I am not insane. I spent the next week in the city, taking a room in the hotel where my cousin once lived. For the first few days, I made more attempts at calling him, yet his phone remained off. Eventually, I made peace with the likelihood of him no longer being among the living. After a week of hiding, in the middle of the day, I made the drive back to my grandfather's property. I was not planning on spending the night, or any extended amount of time in the cottage. All I wanted to do was to gather my belongings, so that I would never need to see the place again. I, however, was not welcome. The mute guards met my car well before I entered the property. They said nothing and let the tips of their rifles draw all conclusions. I did not argue. I did not try to make my way back to the cottage to gather my belongings. I did not try to make my way back to the cottage, for it was burnt to the ground. I never should have entered that antique store, and I definitely shouldn't have bought that mask. Gannon's is known for buying and selling rare and unique antiques, and I wanted to impress my friends with a unique Halloween costume this year, so I thought the perfect solution would be to get my hands on a genuine antique costume, one of those strange, ultra-creepy ones from the 1800s or earlier. Sure, it would cost me, but can you really put a price on standing out? The bell over the door jingled dully as I opened the door and walked in. The proprietor, and grey, bent-over man with a thick, bushy beard and thick, round-rimmed spectacles, who was 90 if he was a day, casually acknowledged me and went back to the ancient book he was examining. The store wasn't big, but it had space. Only every last bit of that space was filled with relics of bygone eras. Not the usual furniture, silverware, and paintings of your typical antique shop. No, everything here had a story, and as such, everything here commanded a premium price. There was an old cavalry saber that was known to have killed no less than 7 men in the Civil War. It even still had flecks of blood from its victims spattered along the blade and hilt. There was an old rope noose that had supposedly been used to hang a witch during the Salem witch trials. There was an ancient tome with strange symbols on the cover that once belonged to a European court wizard. There was even a hat that once belonged to a certain H. Holmes. The stories attached to each item were historical, mystical, and often macabre, and I loved it. I didn't believe in magic or mysticism, angels and demons, or anything else beyond what science could explain. That didn't mean that I wasn't fascinated by stories involving them, though. How much more interesting would the world be if the supernatural actually did exist? It was a tantalizing proposition, and it's why I had to buy it as soon as I saw it. It was a wolf mask. Not a mask made to look like a wolf, but a mask made out of the skin and fur of a wolf's head and neck. It was a masterful work of preservation and artistry that looked as alive on display that day as the creature itself must have looked in life. I picked it up carefully, turning it over and around in my hand so I could see it from every angle. The work was beyond fine. I couldn't even see the seams and threads that held it together. Not a single hair seemed to be missing from the thick grey fur. The teeth were real and firmly fixed into the snout. I assumed they were so well done because the original jaws had been used to form the snarling mouth. The eyes were glass, and far too lifelike for such an aged item, perfect replicas of thin glass set in the eye sockets. I had to have it. I checked the story card next to the original display. The price was outrageous, but I didn't care. Not only was the mask perfect, but the supposed history couldn't have been more ideal for the season. It read simply, "Enchanted mask made from the preserved skin of a loup-garou slain in Burgundy, France in 1137 AD. Do not wear at night." "Oh, ho, 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 ho," I grunted excitedly. "I have plans for you." I brought the mask and story card to the checkout. Old man Gannon checked the item, and me with more scrutiny than I was really comfortable with before speaking. "Heed the warning, boy," he said sternly. "It wouldn't do for you to tempt fate." I chuckled, ignoring the fact that he called me boy. He was probably the oldest man in town, so everyone was boy or girl to him. "You don't have to worry about me," I assured him. "You got any more documentation that goes with this? If I'm going to fork over $2,000 for a mask, I want as much provenance as I can get." Old man Gannon grunted derisively. "Of course I have documents that go with it. A fair few, actually. Be sure that you read them and take proper precautions." "Of course," I replied seriously, lying through my teeth. The supernatural is not real after all. It's a myth, legend, just stories. What this mask was, to me, was the foundation of the absolute best Halloween costume I had ever concocted. Sure, a werewolf costume wouldn't be especially unique, but with that mask, it would be the most frighteningly real one our town had ever seen. The old man went into the back room and quickly returned with a binder filled with documents in protectors and a small leather-bound journal. "These are the provenance," he declared. "The journal is of particular interest as it belonged to a previous owner of the mask, a Mr. Archibald Wembley of London, wrote it in the years 1512 through 1514. He went mad after wearing the mask and killed 2 people before he was cut down in the street. Witnesses swore that he looked more animal than man before he died. The police report is document 123. I set the mask on the counter and quickly leafed through the documents. There were originals and English translations for each. "All this and you're only charging $2,000, I asked incredulously. "Such a unique relic with this much provenance together, it has to be worth more." Old man Gannon nodded his head. Yes it is," he confirmed. "I actually paid more for it myself, but—" He trailed off. "Something about that particular item unsettles me. I wish to be rid of it sooner rather than later, so I'm taking a loss for my own peace of mind." I didn't question it. If this old man was willing to let his superstitions be my gain, I was perfectly fine with it. I paid for the mask and happily took it home. Looking back, I should never have been so sure of myself, nor so proud, nor so certain about how the world works. The events that followed changed my perspective of the nature of reality itself, and I don't think I'll ever be able to go back to how I was. In my defense, and also to remove any possibility that I can claim ignorance if I get desperate enough, I need to confess that I did read the provenance documents right away. I didn't read them to get any warnings to heed, or as some kind of user manual. I read them to learn the history of my beautiful, terrifyingly creepy wolf mask. Having the story at the tip of my tongue top tell at will would truly be the icing on what I knew would be a most impressive and frightening cake, or, rather, costume. The earliest documents were all about the supposed loup-garou that was terrorizing the Burgundian countryside, and the hunt to put an end to the gruesome string of murders it was blamed for. Document 20 was a notice celebrating that the foul beast had finally been killed and skinned by a visiting huntsman who only asked to be allowed to keep the skin and take it back to him home as his reward. The local ruler, only too happy to get off so cheaply, permitted it. The huntsman wrote that he brought the hide to a supposed witch named Lucia, who lived alone on a mountain named Musla in modern-day Slovakia. He paid her handsomely with instructions to use the hide to create an item of power, one that would make him strong. Apparently she obliged, making the wolf mask, and he was happy, but it came with a strict set of rules. 1. Never wear the mask at night. 2. Never wear the mask on the day or night of the full moon. 3. Never wear the mask during the autumnal equinox. 4. Always invoke the name of Christ before donning the mask. The man must have been wildly superstitious, because he followed the rules religiously. The following documents are filled with fanciful tales of the huntsman performing mighty deeds that led to him earning a minor lordship before retiring to administer his land holdings and eventually dying of old age. What followed after was one document after another that spoke of the mask passing to a new owner who either did not read or chose not to follow the rules, and how each one ultimately went mad, committing a varying number of murders, and being either killed during the apprehension or executed for their crimes. It gained a reputation as a cursed item that turned men into mindless beasts and drove them to kill and even cannibalize their victims. "Holy crap!" I exclaimed as I finished reading the last page in the binder. "This is even better than I thought. I wonder what that Wembley guy wrote in his diary." It was getting late, so I decided to put off reading the diary for another day. I picked up my mask and looked it over, admiring it for both its craftsmanship and its history. "You just might be the coolest thing I'll ever own," I said to it as I caressed its cheek. I looked into the glass eyes, and maybe it was a trick of the light, Or maybe it was the lateness of the hour playing tricks with my mind, but I could have sworn those eyes, those glass eyes, looked back at me. I awoke the next morning to my girlfriend letting herself into my apartment. Her key clicked in the lock, and the door squeaked noisily as she opened it. "Wake up, sleepyhead," she called. I sat up and groaned in response as I rubbed the sleep out of my eyes. I checked the clock on my nightstand, saw the time, and got annoyed. "It's 7 a.m. on a Saturday. We have plans, remember?" she called out. "We're supposed to—" "What is this?" she asked. Her tone changed from businesslike to pure excitement. I stepped out of my bedroom clad in nothing but my night pants. She was excitedly holding up the wolf mask and admiring it. "It's a cursed wolf mask," I replied with a yawn. "It's the centerpiece of my Halloween costume this year." "It looks so real," she said admiringly. Then her expression darkened, and she put the mask down on the table. "Did you say cursed?" she sharply inquired. "Yeah," I yawned again. "It's almost 1,000 years old. The documents it came with say that a bunch of its previous owners went psycho and started killing people." "And you bought it?" she practically shrieked. "And you're going to wear it?" I filled the coffee maker and turned it on. "Don't tell me you believe in magic, voodoo, curses and all that nonsense," I replied tiredly. She took pause at that. I knew her answer. It was a major point of agreement between us. What science can't explain either isn't real, or just hasn't been properly explained yet. Nothing is supernatural. She finally replied, "It's just—" She paused. "If a bunch of people who owned it really did turn into psycho killers, there's got to be something there." I poured a cup of black coffee from the still brewing pot and took a sip. It was too hot, but I didn't care. "Sure there is," I replied. "Social contagion. People believe it's cursed, so they respond as though it's cursed. It's nothing special." It must have made sense to her, because her whole attitude changed again. "Have you tried it on yet?" she asked with a slight smile, her fear replaced with the admiration and curiosity she had when she first laid eyes on the mask. It struck me that I hadn't, so I picked it up, looked my girlfriend in the eyes, said, "Jesus Christ," in a mocking tone, and put it on. It felt perfect, as though it were made just for me. It slipped over my head easily and seemed to snug down to a perfect form fit. It had no odor, and I could see clearly with a full field of view through the glass eyes. "Not until just now," I replied teasingly. "Eek!" she shrieked. "What?" I asked, alarmed, turning my head rapidly to see what had so alarmed her. "The mouth moved when you talked," she squealed. "It moved, and it moved in a perfect match for your words." I cocked my head to the side and looked at her quizzically. "For real?" I asked. "It's moving with my mouth." "Yes," she said excitedly. "Go see in the mirror." I did. I spoke. "Abracadabra, hocus pocus, jiggity jocus," I said to my reflection. Sure enough, the mouth moved in a lupine imitation of my own mouth movements. The movement was so well synced that I could swear I even saw the lips move, although I knew it to be impossible. I took the mask off and admired it with the fattest grin of all time on my face. "That's amazing," I exclaimed. "That old witch was a real master. I didn't know people even knew how to make a mask's mouth move in the 12th century." "I know, right?" my girlfriend Tiffany said with as much excitement as I felt. "You're going to have an amazing Halloween costume this year." I removed the mask, smiled at her, and nodded my head in affirmation. "Just one thing," she said with a hint of confusion. "What's with that thing you said before you put the mask on?" It took me a moment to remember what she was talking about. "Oh," I snapped my fingers as I remembered. There was a silly little list of rules. I was mocking them. I grabbed the folder of provenance and flipped to the page with the rules on it. "See?" I said, pointing at the small passage. 4 ridiculous rules. Tiffany read them quickly and looked at me with a touch of confusion. "People actually believe this crap?" she said incredulously. "I know, right?" I laughed. She laughed with me for a bit, then stopped suddenly and glared at me. "Wait a minute," she said sternly. "How much did you pay for this mask anyway?" "Oh." The next few days were perfectly ordinary until the 17th. That was the day I finished assembling my costume, and one of 2 full moons in a row this year. I remember bringing home a pair of retro ripped jeans to go with the red plaid flannel shirt, theatre prop quality werewolf gloves, complete with a set of long claws tipping the fingers, and other clothing reminiscent of an 80s era movie Werewolf. The sun had set hours earlier. I obtained the pants shopping with Tiffany after our dinner date, and I was absolutely thrilled. I couldn't wait to try it all on and see how it went together. It was glorious. I donned the outfit, then slowly, almost ritualistically lowered the mask over my head to complete the costume. It was like magic in the mirror. I looked myself over, and I loved what I saw. I looked like something out of Teen Wolf, only better. Sure, I could have achieved something very much like it far more cheaply. I could have just gone to Spirit Halloween, bought a costume or a rubber mask, and went to Walmart for finishing touches and adjustments, and done a satisfactory job for under $200, but that's not what I wanted. I wanted the Riz. I wanted to stand out among all the other costumed partygoers at the fraternity Halloween party. This costume absolutely did it, and I couldn't have been happier. In my ecstasy, I noticed a feeling running through my body, as though there was a kind of energy coursing through me. It wasn't as simple as a burning in my blood or my nerves were on fire. No, it was a feeling of power, as though I was still myself, but also something more. I felt as though I could toss 4 men over my shoulders and run a marathon. I felt as though I could get in a bar fight and kick every ass in the place. I felt godly. I removed the mask after a few minutes and inspected my outfit without it. I felt normal again, and somehow it felt wrong. I felt like my ordinary self was somehow no longer enough. I felt incomplete, like I removed a piece of myself when I removed the mask. Stop being ridiculous, I told my reflection. You're letting myth and superstition influence you. You're better than that. And yet, I felt like I was lying to myself. Right there, staring at my reflection, I felt like the man looking back at me wasn't really me, like something unknowable was missing. I looked at my reflection, and it felt as though I was looking at someone else, someone I didn't really know, and who could never truly know me in return. I shook my head to clear the strange thoughts and center myself again. Pictures, I reminded myself. Tiffany wanted pictures so she could put together something complimentary. I took out my phone and held it up to the mirror to take a picture, and paused. I couldn't send her a picture like this. My costume was incomplete. I needed to wear the mask, or else my costume wasn't really my costume. And how could she possibly match her costume to mine if I sent her an incomplete photo? I picked up the mask to put it on and paused. I paused to look at it, to admire it. I looked into its lifelike glass eyes. I stroked its fur as though it were a living thing. "You're mine," I told it in a low, almost silent voice. "You're mine, and I am your master." I continued to stare into those perfectly crafted glass eyes, losing myself in them, and wanting nothing in the world so much as I wanted to put that mask on and forget myself. Slowly, almost robotically, I raised it up and gently lowered it over my head. I felt a rush of euphoria, like what I felt earlier, only 100 times more potent. I took my phone in hand, opened the camera app, raised it, and snapped a single picture of myself in the mirror. I opened text messaging, selected Tiffany, attached the message, and typed the following text. "It's complete, and now I'm complete." I hit send. I looked into the mirror and met my own gaze staring back at me through those glass eyes that had no business looking as real and alive as they did, and then the world went blank. I awoke the next day with no idea where I was. I opened my eyes only to be greeted by the rising sun in the middle of a forest. A forest. There was a forest outside of town, but it wasn't exactly a short walk if you catch my drift. It was easily a half an hour's drive once you got out of town, and not exactly the kind of thing you just get up and walk to like you're taking the dog out to the local community park. I woke up there, and not on the edge either, but well inside the borders, and I was covered in a red, sticky substance that could only be blood, and my stomach hurt like I had gotten drunk and did my best to eat my own body weight at the local Asian buffet. "What the?" I trailed off as I looked at my hands and arms and was taken aback by the dried red and brown goop covering them. I looked down at myself and saw that I was still in my costume, and my clothing was utterly ruined, covered in a deep red liquid that was surely blood. I realized that I was still wearing the mask, and I ripped it off of my head in a panic. My breath came in great heaves, uncontrollable, and my head began to swim as I hyperventilated. I closed my eyes and forced myself to calm down. I made myself breathe slower, and slower, and slower still, until I finally brought it down to normal. I focused on my heart rate, and gradually brought it down with a blend of deep breathing and mind clearing. Once I had myself physically under control, I looked at myself again. How did I get covered in such a disgustingly massive amount of blood? Why did my stomach hurt so much? How did the wolf mask manage to stay clean when the rest of me was drenched in filth? And why did I? My stomach finally gave up and rebelled. I dropped the wolf mask and fell to my knees, retching and vomiting a copious amount of stomach contents. I vomited even as I found myself losing my breath and desperately wanting to breathe. I vomited even as my lack of breath began to make my head swim. I vomited even as my vision blurred and blackened at the edges. Then I was able to breathe again. I took in great gasping gulps of air. I heaved and panted as I sought to restore my oxygen supply. Then I vomited again. If possible, I can say that the second round was worse than the third. It didn't hit me so continuously as to cut me off from breathing completely like the first round did, but it did let me get just enough breath to barely subsist before striking again, until I thought I would surely pass out, and then it subsided just long enough to tease me again before taking over and nearly choking me to death over and over and over again until I wished that I could just die and get it over with. When I was finally finished, my stomach felt better, but there was glistening pile of partially digested stomach contents all over the ground in front of me. I wish I could say that I knew what I was looking at, but it was all so thoroughly masticated that I couldn't hope pick one bit from another. All I knew was that none of it looked cooked, and I didn't see anything that could pass for a vegetable anywhere in the nasty mix. My stomach felt better, though. I picked up my mask, chose a random direction, and began to walk. I must have chosen well, because after only 2 hours, I came across a road. I'm not ignorant. I've driven in and out of town plenty of times. I know my way around in town and around the outskirts of my hometown. That's why I knew that I needed to go left once I reached this road if I wanted to get home. How long would it take? Fucked if I know. All that mattered was I was going the right direction, and the rest would fall into place one way or another. And fall into place it did. Less than an hour of walking later, a random pickup truck pulled over. The driver listened to my story and told me to hop in the bed of his truck and he'd take me into town. I did it gratefully, and he was as good as his word. Better even. He dropped me off outside my apartment building, told me to stay off the drugs, and went on his merry way. I went inside, took the elevator to my floor, opened my door without needing to use my key, which was also weird since I never, ever left my apartment without locking it, and immediately rushed to the shower so I could get clean and feel human again. I was brushing my teeth for the third time when I heard my phone ringing. It was on the floor, pushed up against the wall under the sink. Why? I don't know, but I found it, pulled it out, and answered the call. "Where have you been?" Tiffany practically shrieked in my ear. "I've been calling and texting all night, and I haven't heard a word from you. If you didn't pick up the phone this time, I was going to call the cops to make sure you weren't dead." On the one hand, it felt surreal being yelled at so mundanely after the freaky mystery I woke up to. On the other, what in the ever-living hell was going on? I let my girlfriend yell for a while until she was all shouted out. Then I responded. "I don't know where I was last night," I told her in a shaky voice. One minute I was home, the next I was waking up in the middle of nowhere covered in blood. This set off another wave of panicked screeching that eventually settled down into sobbing and expressions of gratitude that I was all right. She told me she was coming right over and hung up before I could protest. I had a very, very bad feeling about her coming over. It literally took all day to get Tiffany settled down and comfortable with the fact that, in spite of everything, I was all right. I didn't tell her about how my body had violently purged my stomach of an inhuman amount of raw flesh shortly after waking up. I was already washed up, and my bloody costume was in the wash, getting as clean as I could hope for it to be. It was actually the laundry that got her settled down. She volunteered to take my costume out of the dryer, and was absolutely delighted to see that I had added to it by dyeing in a bunch of red and brown staining. "It actually looks like you ripped something apart and ate it," she said excitedly. "You're so good at making Halloween costumes." "Yeah," I said slowly before trailing off. "I modified it." She didn't give me a chance to finish my words or my thoughts before she jumped me. Perhaps if she hadn't been so excited and relieved that I was safe and healthy, things would have turned out differently. Perhaps if our intimate life wasn't so frequent and vigorous, everything would have turned out differently. As it was, I succumbed to her passion, and we fell asleep in each other's arms for an afternoon nap. I awoke before Tiffany did, and I went to the living room to examine the mask. I felt scared holding it. It felt wrong to put my hands upon that artifact, as though I was touching a power I could not hope to control or comprehend. I turned it over and over and over again, examining it to the finest detail. Why did this mask, out of everything I wore last night, not have a single drop of blood on it? Why was the last thing I could remember putting it on and taking a selfie? That thought triggered something in me. and I took out my phone. I didn't have it with me in the forest, and I couldn't remember checking the picture I took or sending it to Tiffany. I opened the photos and looked at the last picture I took. I don't know what I was expecting. Maybe a photo of myself mid-metamorphosis. I thought I'd catch myself becoming something other than, well, me. What I actually saw was me, in my costume, with my phone in my hand. I looked at the picture again, not really believing that it could be so mundane, and I thought I could see something different in those lifelike glass eyes. I thought that maybe, just maybe, there was a hint of something in there that was not only me. But no, it couldn't be. The supernatural isn't real after all. It's all hokum, bunk, small-minded garbage that enlightened people like me didn't believe in. The sun had set. It wasn't down for long, but it was the second day of the rarest kind of blue moon event, the kind where the full moon happens 2 days in a row. I looked into the eyes of the mask. This perfect, masterfully crafted mask, lifted it up and lowered it onto my head. I woke up the next morning, the 19th of October, a mere week ago, to the most horrifying sight of my life. I awoke on the floor of my own apartment, but once again I was covered in blood and filth. Ow! I screamed in horror, not understanding where the ungodly mess had come from. My stomach was killing me. I rushed to my bathroom and barely made it to the toilet before my stomach decided to evacuate its contents. Then, and keep evacuating itself even when there was nothing but water and bile left to push out. It went on and on and on, until I wished I would just die rather than endure another moment of such violent illness. I flushed the toilet whenever I had the presence of mind to do so, without checking to see what had come out of me. I had seen what came out the day before, and I didn't want to see it again. Perhaps that's why I failed to recognize any of the bits and parts, the solid matter mixed in with the wretched fluids that erupted from my stomach and out of my mouth. Regardless, I was glued to the toilet until my stomach finally settled down after who knows how long. Then I stripped my bloody clothing and took a shower so hot I felt like it might burn the skin from my bones, and I was okay with that. I felt dirty inside and out. It was wrong in every way, down to my soul if I had believed it at the time. I felt wrong, dirty, and thoroughly corrupted. I was in the shower for an hour, lost in feelings rather than thought, wondering what had happened and how I managed to wind up covered in blood again in my own apartment. It was only when I finally shut off the water and was halfway through drying off that it hit me. "Tiffany!" I screamed, and I ran to my bedroom. I burst into my bedroom and was greeted by the most horrific mess I could possibly imagine. The entire room was splattered with blood and viscera. Not a surface was spared, as at least some red drops or other. Scraps was on every surface, every knick-knack, everything in the room. My screams only got louder and more insistent as I scanned the room and found the head of Tiffany, my beautiful Tiffany, beloved girlfriend of 3 years, on a pillow, fully detached from her body, lifeless eyes staring off into the void. I hurled myself to it, reaching desperately, not willing to believe in what I was seeing. I picked it up and stared into her sightless eyes and burst into tears. "Tiffany," I sobbed. "How? Why?" I looked around and took the horrific scene in. I recognized the various parts of my beloved scattered around the room, legs and arms tossed about, bones scattered all over, looking like they had been gnawed upon by a great beast, and not one of her internal organs to be seen. I remembered how upset my stomach was when I woke up, and how distended it appeared before I threw up the contents in a prolonged and violent fit. How much of her had I simply flushed away, not knowing what I was doing because I refused to just open my eyes as I vomited up my sick. I dropped Tiffany's head back onto my bed and scrambled to the living room. I picked up the diary of Archibald Wembley and read it thoroughly. Much of it was a repeat of what I had already read before in the other provenance, until I got to the end. Here is what is read. I should have listened to the rules. I should have learned from the mistakes of others. I didn't, and now I am paying the price for my foolishness. The mask is gone, but I can feel its influence on me even as I write these words. I blacked out again last night, and when I awoke this morning, my family was dead, ripped apart from some foul beast. Every last one of them. My wife Abigail, and the children George, Franklin, Erin, and Caleb. All of them were torn apart. Only I was spared, and I was covered in such an amount of blood and gore that it could only have come from many animals, of a family of people. I ignored the rules. I wore the mask at night. I wore it on the full moon. It amused me to do so, and I did it without once invoking the name of Christ for protection. I was a fool, and my family has paid the price for my pride and lack of faith. The mask is gone, but I can still feel it within me somehow, as though it has become a part of me. I do not know what the future will bring, but I fear it will be more bloodshed, and it will be me in some beastly form, rending apart my fellow man in bestial glee. I only hope that someone stops me before I go too far. God help me and spare the innocent. I put the diary down and sat back stunned. Then it dawned on me, where was the wolf mask? I tore my apartment searching for it, I really did, but I could not find it. Still, I can feel its presence, like it's lost, but also not. It's like it's here with me, even though I cannot see it. Today is only 5 days until Halloween. The sun has set and I feel strong, stronger than I have any right to feel. My dead girlfriend remains rotting in my bedroom, and it smells horrible. The neighbors are sure to complain soon. I don't understand what's going on, but I do know this. I never should have bought that mask, and once I bought it, I never should have broken the rules. How was I supposed to know it was a real cursed object? There's no science that can explain curses. Real, magical curses. Magic isn't real, right? Who am I kidding? I believe in magic. Now. But I came to believe too late. Too late to save my beloved Tiffany, and too late to save myself. I need to flee. I need to get away from here as soon as possible. I can feel the beast inside of me, and it wants to get out. I need to get as far away from people as possible, to disappear and never be seen again. But I'm hungry, and there's a great nightclub not far from here, and the night is young. Perhaps I'll stop in for a bite to eat before I begin my journey. With that said, thanks for watching, and until next time.